You are tuned into Salam Media. This is, of course, News and Views. I'm your host, Zahid Jadwat. Coming up next, my guest, Dr. Haidar Eid, Associate Professor at Al-Aqsa University in Gaza. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me on your show, Zahid.
So, I'm sure the listeners would recall some while back, it was, I think, in the beginning of October, when Israel launched this ghastly attack on Palestinian sovereignty, on Palestinian society, when a voice note had gone viral, in which you were speaking, making basically a plea for help as you were trapped in Gaza. You've since returned to South Africa. I think a good starting point would be if you could describe to us where you were on the 7th of October in Gaza and how the events unfolded from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much again, and Zahid, for having me on your show. But let me start by just saying, telling you about the news I've just received from Khan Yunis in Gaza, in the southern part of Gaza, where Jana Qudeh, a 14 years old girl, a beautiful girl, who has just died, who has starved to death with she's been for 3 days with no food, with no drinking water whatsoever, and she just died. I felt that I needed to begin by telling you Jana's story, and it tells you a lot about what is happening in Palestine. Jana's story is a microcosm for a much larger macrocosm. Jana is Gaza, and Gaza is being starved to death by apartheid Israel. What happened after the events of October the 7th, I lived at the time, I lived in Rimal in Gaza City itself, which is, in the western part of Gaza City. And the events, we were surprised. Everybody was taken by surprise by what happened on the 7th of October. The following day, or 2 days after that, we were contacted by Israeli intelligence officers asking us to leave Rimal and head towards the north. And they were shelling the north at that time, so they wanted us to die in the north. So we had to leave our residential tower, myself, my partner, my wife, and my two little daughters, 7 and 6 years old. And because we couldn't go to the north, we took refuge in a neighbor's house opposite our place. It was a little bit safer. And we spent the whole night there, stuck with about 60 to 70 people in a very tiny, narrow corridor, a narrow passage with our kids. And the Israelis kept chilling the whole neighborhood all night long. And of course, we had to protect our children and our women. So I was covering all the time, was covering the ears of my daughters, trying to cover their mouths and noses with wet cloths because there was terrible smoke, terrible smoke. So much so that I couldn't cover my ears, and this is why I lost, hearing in my right ear, and 50% of my left ear I cannot hear. And the first thing I did when I, upon arrival in South Africa, is having hearing aids. And then we decided to go. The following day, when we found out that the whole neighborhood was flattened to the ground, we decided to go to my brother's house in the north. We stayed with my brother and his daughters and son and wife for 3 days. And then we were contacted again by the same Israeli intelligence officers asking us to head to the south. And then we had to head to the south because there was shelling everywhere. So we took our families, my brother's family and my own family, all of us in one car, and we headed to the south, where we stayed with my sister near the Egyptian borders until last week, when I was contacted by the South African embassy in Ramallah and the South African embassy in Cairo, asking me as a South African citizen, to head to the Rafah crossing with my family. And then they flew us to South Africa. And here we are.
I think it was quite a lengthy ordeal, and quite a traumatic experience, I suppose. But also, I think in this whole situation, apartheid Israel's excuse has been that it wishes to eliminate Hamas. For anyone out there who might still believe this fallacy, you were there in Gaza. You saw the destruction that was happening there. What would you say to them?
You know, I usually don't like to respond to Zionist haspara. Haspara is a Hebrew word for propaganda. I think any decent human being who wants to know the truth can find out the truth. Even the American president, who fully supports apartheid Israel, who, as soon as he felt that there was something wrong going on and Israel was losing the battle against the Palestinians, he flew to Israel in order to show them their full support. Last week, the 200th plane loaded with weapons just landed in Ben Gurion Airport, coming from the United States of America. 2 days ago, Security Council issued a resolution calling for only an immediate ceasefire, nothing else. Only ceasefire, saving the lives of Palestinian children. And you know what? It was vetoed by the United States of America. Yesterday, there was a resolution endorsed by the United Nations, not the Security Council. The overwhelming majority of the world, of the international community, called for an immediate ceasefire, with the exception of apartheid Israel and United States of America, and a couple of two useless states that the names of which I cannot even remember. Now, if I want to directly answer your question, you know, the figure, and I don't like to talk about figures and numbers because we are talking about people, human beings with dreams, with memories, with families. The figure has reached more than 18,000 people who have died, more than 8,200 of whom are children. More than 8,000 people are children who
Mm,
have lost their lives as a result of Israel's attack on Gaza, including more than 7,000 women. Between 60 to 65% of those who got killed are children and women. 80% of Gaza's housing units and infrastructure has been destroyed by apartheid Israel. And as if that is not enough, Israel has decided to starve Gazans to death. Look, I remember spending nights crying because I couldn't provide my two little daughters, I'm talking about 7 and 6 years old, with food. At night, they would say to me, "We are hungry," and I wouldn't be able to provide them with food. I mean, my two little kids are waking up every single night with nightmares. They know words that no child should know. The word anqad, which means rubble, the most hated word in the Gaza Strip. My two little children keep saying to me, "We don't want to be found dead under Al Anqad, under the rubble." People in Gaza have no cleaning water, have no food, have no medicine, have nothing whatsoever. The seven crossings separating Gaza from the world, six of these crossings are controlled by apartheid Israel, and the seventh is the Rafah crossing. All seven crossings have been closed since day one. No international aid entered Gaza. Nothing, absolutely nothing. I was living with five other families. We would, excuse me, we had no electricity, we had no drinking water. We would bring water from the mosque, boil it in order, to purify it and drink it. After that, we would cook on fire, we would burn fire and then cook on fire, just to provide food to our children. And what was the food? We had no eggs, we had no biscuits, we had no chocolate, we had no chicken, even meat we didn't have. So we tried to, sometimes we find potatoes, sometimes we find parsley, sometimes we find, you name it. So what is happening right now to the people of Gaza, to the 2.3 million civilians living in the Gaza Strip, is literally a genocide. Initially, at the beginning of this ongoing genocide, my opinion was that it is a combination, in fact, of genocide and ethnic cleansing. They wanted to kill as many civilians as possible, and they are doing that. And they are doing that because the whole world is not only complicit, the colonial West has been involved in the crimes against humanity committed against the Palestinians of Gaza. And what we are calling for in Gaza, anybody who's listening to me, what do we want? We want an immediate ceasefire. We wanted an immediate ceasefire, and we wanted the overflow of humanitarian aid into Gaza, because Jannah last night died as a result of starvation and hunger. This is what we are asking for. We are asking for basic and fundamental human rights, nothing less and nothing more. And the international community has decided to stand idle and watch us and watch our children and women dying as a result of the latest American made weapons. I mean, Israel has, you know, Merkava tanks, Apache helicopters, F-16 and F-15 and F-35. Israel has one of the strongest armies in the world, equipped with more than 450 nuclear heads. And what do we Palestinians have? What do our children have? They have their naked bodies and they have their stomachs. And now they are targeting our children's stomach, and they are starving them to death. And this is what I have to say to people who are listening to us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think it should take so long for one human to hear the plea of another human. And not just another human, these are thousands, millions of people who are suffering as a result of a human made, a man made catastrophe that is happening and unfolding in Gaza. Just finally, as a South African citizen, in fact, just before we had you on air, we were speaking to an activist who recently published analysis about the South African government's stance towards Israel. And I want to hear from you as a South African citizen. Are you satisfied with the South African government's response to what is happening there?
Look, I think, this is a long story of the history between, white South Africa, apartheid, South Africa, and apartheid Israel. And I think as a result of that strategic alliance between the apartheid regime and apartheid Israel, the post-apartheid South Africa should take a much, much stronger stance. I think what the South African Parliament, the resolution endorsed, the decision endorsed by the South African Parliament, shows that there is a consensus amongst South Africans, across race, across religion, across culture, etc., that South Africa, should sever all diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel. And I think the South African government has taken a good step, by calling the South African ambassador to Tel Aviv, by taking the decisions that it decided to take last week. But I think more is needed. In fact, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the South African people, in their struggle against the apartheid system, they wanted the international community to boycott apartheid, to divest from from international companies benefiting from apartheid's oppression of the South African people, and called on the United Nations and Security Council to impose sanctions against the apartheid regime. And this is exactly what we want from the South African government. We want the South African government to lead a campaign of military embargo. This is extremely necessary right now for us, people of Palestine and people in Gaza in particular. A military embargo. No weapons should be sold. No weapons whatsoever should be sold to apartheid Israel. And we want South Africa to lead a new anti-apartheid movement. We've already initiated our anti-apartheid movement in Palestine, and we are expecting the South African government, in spite of all the good things that it has been doing to the Palestinian cause, but we want one step more than that. We want them to endorse the BDS call made in 2005 by the overwhelming majority of Palestinian civil society and its political organizations. And as I said to you, you were expecting the international community to have no business whatsoever whatsoever with the apartheid regime. And this is exactly what we want. South Africa has a very heavy moral weight because of its history and the legacy of its anti apartheid activism and struggle against apartheid and white supremacy. It's time for South Africa to take a much stronger stand against apartheid Israel and lead an anti-apartheid campaign that will lead to the end of apartheid in Israel. Look, there is an overwhelming consensus amongst human rights, communities, whether B'Tselem International or Human Rights International, or even Israel's mainstream human rights organizations such as B'Tselem, labeling Israel as an apartheid state. Now, if major human rights organizations, the international community, are calling Israel an apartheid state and a settler colony, what is the South African government waiting in order to cut and sever all diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel until all Palestinians get their fundamental and basic rights? And when I say basic rights, I'm talking about freedom, I'm talking about right of return, justice, and I'm talking about equality. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you so much for that and for sharing your experience with us. I hope you go well and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
You're welcome. That was Dr. Haidar Eid, an associate professor at Al-Aqsa University in Gaza. He's actually just returned to South Africa recently, speaking to us about his experience there since the 7th of October, and of course, what kind of action he would like to see from the South African government as a South African citizen. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll move on to the next conversation, and that, of course, Puma ending its sponsorship deal for an Israeli football team.